Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space. Hope you enjoy. The Debt Repaid, written by Ruby Spicer. Finglui, Miglaunaf, Cthulhu, Rulya, Wugarnagle, Ftagan. Finglui, Miglaunaf, Cthulhu, Rulya, Wugarnagle, Ftagan. Finglui, Miglaunaf, Cthulhu, Rulya, Wugarnagle, Ftagan. It was the chant that had been heard across the multiverse, or at least the ones familiar with the tentacle-faced being and his skin. They had been so thankful, Panoth and his people, that Cthulhu had not been heard nor seen of for eons. He lived on only in tales, songs, legends. To the current generations, he was little more than a myth, a demon to terrorize their darkest dreams and frighten hatchlings into good behavior, an unreal being to any who lived. Until now. As he and his men walked to what would surely be their deaths, he wondered how his people would take news that Cthulhu existed in living memory again. This was a small planet in a small system, but nearly perfect for all forms of life. And though the Terrans had allies that came to their defense, eventually Panoth's forces broke through those defenses and came to land on Earth itself. A perimeter had been quickly established against ground resistance, and all had looked well. Victory was in their grasp. They needed only reach out and take it to secure this little backwater system. After all, the other planets had little more than exploratory bases. Most of what lay beyond was puny beings called Jupiter was resource-gathering bases. They had barely colonized the inner planets, and, in fact, most seemed reluctant to leave their system at all. Yes, an easy victory. There were some humans taken prisoner, civilians, but strong-looking. They'd had small weapons on their persons, but each, at least as ones Panoth had taken the trouble to supervise, had surrendered these weapons. He sensed nothing of deception in them, but instead an enduring patience, a hopeful watchfulness. They knew they would suffer, but they were completely assured that they would be saved. But by who? Or what? Their allies had been destroyed, and there was no chance of getting out a message to get more. Perhaps they mean to destroy themselves. Some planets have tried that. An officer suggested it, but Panoth waved it away. If they were going to go that route, they would have done it before now, or we would have seen some sign of it being set up. Perhaps a weapon we've yet to uncover, no. They would have used it all as well, surely. The speculation went on for some time, until the idea of questioning the prisoners came to mind. Sure, with some persuasion, they would tell all that was necessary, and more besides. But they all gave the same answer, in a tongue that reached into Panoth's guts and twisted hard. These were not words, not speech, but rather sounds, guttural, wild, slapped together, and what some deranged child playing at a language construction might consider to be such. Chanted, prayed, screamed, and only one word in the whole mess made any sense. Finglui, Miglaunaf, Cthulhu, Rulya, Wugarnagle, Ftagan. Briefly, very briefly, they could sense connection. As each human spoke those words, it was as if they were connecting mentally to someone or something else, like a spark that quickly went out when you looked at it. Once they sensed it, the feeling disappeared from their minds and couldn't be felt again. The prisoners were returned to their cells, which echoed suddenly with the sentence that struck them with all the growing sense of fear. They did not understand what was being said, except the one name, Cthulhu. The fear that struck them was only temporary, although the words played over and over in all the minds of those who had been heard them. Clearly, the humans had worshipped him. But how? How, when he had not been seen in so long? He is older than this planet, but it's not impossible that he may have... The thought cut itself short. Cthulhu's influence was extensive. Across the universe there was not one soul living who did not at least know of him. But it was senseless. That was simply part of the deal when it came to a being like him. The worship would do them no good. Or perhaps the madness they were clearly bringing out would shield their minds from the damage that being conquered would do to their mental state. As they were discussing this in the conference room, Panoth felt a sudden blow to his psyche, as hard as if he had been a sucker punched in the back of the head, and it took several minutes for him to struggle to his feet from the pain of it. From down the hall, he could see another of his men in the same condition, and he rushed, or rather shambled, to check on him. But before he could get there, a bellowing, watery roar sounded off the outside. With his psychic abilities locked suddenly off from the pain, all Panoth could manage to do was look through the window towards the ocean. And from the water, a monstrosity, a colossus, the image that he had feared as a child, seen in ancient text, doodled in boredom in the history of the multiverse class, that green form, that head with two enormous and ugly eyes, the face with wriggling, massive tentacles, the wings leathery and spreading. That image was now rising from the water before his very eyes. The last thing Panoth heard in his mind before this living legend went on to destroy their defenses, their weapons, their ships, was one small sentence in his mind. 3 little words that had on his mind all the impact of a ship crashing into one's head from orbit. Earth is redacted. Somehow, Panoth and a handful of his men had managed to survive the carnage wrought by the myth come to life. That Cthulhu. There were words of praise uttered by the humans, thanking the Mighty One, praising him for saving them in their darkest hour from the evil invaders. The creature had retreated back into the ocean, and it was here that Panoth had expected to die. He had thought that the humans would almost immediately execute him and his kind, but to his great surprise, they did not even think of doing it. Great Cthulhu, decide your fate. It was all that Panoth could get from the god outside his cell. Now he and all that remained of his army were being marched down a dock towards the sea. All around them the chanting went on. All around them Panoth blinked, and suddenly he was surrounded by complete and utter blackness. He was compelled forward at speed that was impossible without the aid of a ship, and yet here he was, doing it all the same. Not until he passed a star did it occur to him that he was in space, and then, a second later, what he had never seen before, but what he had felt with a bizarre certainty, was his home planet. He moved onward. Suns, stars, black holes he passed without caring, but the planets brought a strange joy, company, minds to connect to thrive off of. He could not stand the feeling of loneliness between them, but there were always more planets nearby. Until there weren't. Time passed. The planets grew further and further apart. The suns collapsed, turned red and white, and finally winked out altogether. The life he had felt so eager to connect to dwindled more and more and more, until they too finally went out. There was not a single soul left for him to find company with, not one mind to connect to within many trillions of light years. The black holes were all that remained. Anger, grief, and then madness. He was furious that what had brought him so much joy could so thoroughly be erased. He was sorrowful at the loss of that joy. And finally, pounding in his hearing organs, headaches, the likes of which he had never felt before in all the use of his psychic abilities. Whispers, scratches, hallucinations that faded the second he got close to them. Please, please let it be over. I would rather die than go on like this. But go on he did, his plea audible to no one but himself. And he did not die. I could not die. But by this point, the booming sound had no meaning to Panoth. Even the black holes began to explode and fade away. Eventually, first company, and then sanity, and then the light itself had abandoned him. Nothing in the known universe could slay him. No weapon could touch him. No mind could battle his own. Nothing could possibly end his life and save him from this eternal misery. He raged, he screamed, he tore open space, hoping to find a weak point between the walls of space-time. But he kept moving with no success on that head, always hoping that he would meet or see someone or something, but there was no one. nothing. Except that lost black hole. The first he had seen in who knew how long. He had made for it, feeling the pull of it, seeing the light of the radiation it was burning off, grateful to feel anything after so long alone with only the freezing dark to keep him company. Trillions on trillions on trillions of times the size of the last sun he had seen was this black hole. And yet it still did not end his existence. Deep into his darkness he fled, hoping still to find relief within it, hoping still that something would be here with him, that someone would connect, even if it were only for a moment. Nothing. Nothing happened. All that lay around him was the eternal swirling, that pulsating nothingness, that poisonous void. He was alone again, and the mote of joy felt from seeing light again was long past. It was almost worse than never having felt the little happiness to begin with. And then there was an explosion. Burning, everything burning, atmosphere. Yes, that was the word. And then air, oxygen-rich, the greenery everywhere. But above all, there was the bellowing of the scaled beasts. He hit the water and sent up a shower of water and rock and dirt. But even here in the blackness of the deep waters, there was still life. He slept and woke and built and slept and woke and built again. The flow of time he could not sense now, but with life around him, the minds, however dim, he could connect to. The sheer joy of having anyone, anything to speak with at all, even if they could not understand a word that he put into their minds. They had not existed when he first came to this world, but every time he slept, there were more of them. His fall had caused a change, but most of it he did not see. He slept in Rulia, in that palace of stone, and every time he woke, the people, the humans, grew in number. And when he was finally able to speak to a human and receive a reply in return, he wept for sheer joy of it. They reached out, they wanted to speak to him, they were in awe of him. When they began to learn of the loneliness he had suffered for eons beyond count. In his greatest darkness, they rescued him. He would never be alone again, and he owed now a debt that could never be repaid. Penolth jumped backwards. He found himself back on a pier again. Wind, waves, humans, birds, sky, water. Then the wood beneath his feet shifted, and he was once more in the darkness. He screamed as he moved forward at a much higher rate than the speed of light. End of story.
I would just quickly like to thank the T5 channel members and patrons. Caspar Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Barkey, It's Difficult to Pronounce, Lord Azrakal, and Arcadian.